For me, it's my pleasure to present our next guest speaker, who is Hannah Partners, Head of Policy and Government Affairs at IRQ. Hannah Partners is the Head of Policy and Government Affairs at IRQ and Chicago headquartered quantum computing company that is developing a scalable quantum computing using electron on alien qubits. Mrs. Partners is an attorney and expert in intersection of quantum technology and policy with experience in policy making, administrative law, and advocacy. After serving as legislative either in the U.S. Senate, she earned his GD, his PhD degree for the George Washington University Law School, where she gained practical experience in federal rulemaking. She leads RNQ local, federal, and international policy and outreach efforts, advocating for RNQ's priorities and advancing quantum technologies development. Today, she will present the implication on policy and quantum technology development when she explores how laws and regulations around the world are shaping the future of quantum research, industry, and innovation. Hannah, thank you for being here with us today. I will turn over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Braulio, for the invitation to speak today and for the introduction. I'm going to share my screen, and my apologies if this takes me a second. Let's see. All right. Do you see just my slides?
Yes, we can see it now. Perfect.
Okay. Great. So as Braulio mentioned, we are going to be discussing the implications of policy on quantum technology development. And I'm Hannah Parnes. I am a trained lawyer with a policy focus. I'm not currently practicing law for the company, but I use a lot of the skills that I gained both in law school and in practice from my time in the federal government here in the United States. And my background is in federal lawmaking, regulatory policy, administrative law, and I work for AeroQ. We are a quantum computing hardware company based in Chicago, Illinois, in the USA. We are developing a novel type of quantum computing chips, which I have a picture of one on the left. We use silicon chips that are manufactured at a commercial foundry, but our secret sauce, as it were, is that we coat the chip in a layer of liquid helium, and then we use electron spin qubits on top of that. So it's a approach that is scaling first, engineering first, and we have a roadmap to developing a large-scale quantum computer. And I have a picture of our lab there. Those of you who are in condensed matter physics lab might find it amusing because we do indeed have windows. And my talk is going to, in part, have a bit of a focus on quantum computing, just because that's my area of working, a bit of a US focus, just because that's my expertise and experience. But I hope that some of the takeaways will be applicable for everyone here from across the world. Okay, so presentation roadmap, what you should take out of this talk today. We're going to start with an introduction to quantum policy, why it matters both to policymakers and to you. And then we're going to examine two policy subject areas that impact quantum technology development. The first will be international cooperation to catalyze scientific discovery and technology development. That's relevant to all of us today because we're all joining from around the world. And the second will be industrial policy, which is policy that impacts technology development, industry, and scientific research. So first, why do policymakers even care about quantum technologies? There's a few reasons. The first bucket of reasons is that there's proactive goals that policymakers want to accomplish because quantum technologies can be economic growth drivers. For example, McKinsey has estimated that by 2035, quantum technologies will create $2 trillion in economic value. And of course, whether it's a state government, a regional government, a nation state, they want to try to capture some of that value because that's enormous. The other proactive reason that I'm going to discuss is that there are impactful use cases that create benefits, potential benefits for society in sectors like pharmaceutical development, computational chemistry to discover new catalysts for fertilizer production, and more. There's use cases that have a positive externality on society. So it's in the government's interest to promote the development of quantum technologies. The other bucket of reasons are more defensive, related to security risks and competition. There are really important national security and defense applications for quantum computing, but there's also a risk of asymmetric power if one nation or organization develops or accesses the technology first. More acute, there are use cases that could harm societal interests. We all have Shor's algorithm top of mind, but the potential of a full-scale quantum computer to break RSA encryption would cause almost unimaginable harm to society. So that is a motivator for policymakers around the world to support quantum development in their own regions. Further, there are three core policy goals that most nations, localities, international organizations share. First is the goal of supporting scientific discovery through basic research. The second is supporting technology development and translation into practice for economic value creation. And the third core policy goal that is shared by most policymakers around the world is national security. So preventing technology from getting into the hands of adversaries or other actors who would use quantum computers either to do harm or in an adversarial fashion. Although these goals are widely shared, there is a lack of consensus about how to pursue these goals. What specific policies should be put into place to further these objectives? Even more interesting, some of the policies to further these goals may either complement each other or conflict with one another. So that leads us to the first policy that we're going to be examining in more detail. So it's international cooperation in quantum technologies. And this objective to create international cooperation actually does support all three of those policy goals. So the first policy goal, scientific discovery. Because many quantum technologies are nascent, still being developed, and different regions have established specializations and advantages, international cooperation can leverage these advances that happen in different parts of the world to further the overall scientific discovery. Basically, we know no one country, no one region can do it alone because there's still a lot of scientific discovery that needs to happen to realize the full potential of these technologies. The second goal that international cooperation can support is economic growth. Cross-border collaborations can lead to not only furthering R&D, but increasing commercialization, whether it's cross-shore commercial collaborations between researchers and industry. This is something that can further and expand economic growth. And finally, international cooperation can support national security interests. It can create soft power with like-minded countries through cooperation, reduce the influence of adversaries and competitors as well. And there's been a variety of approaches to foster international cooperation around the world. So policymaking organizations have taken a variety of approaches. And I've listed a few different types of organizations and approaches they've taken. So some nations and subnational governments, like in the US states, have taken the approach of bilateral agreements with strategic partners. And these agreements often do include some joint funding opportunities, just bilateral between the US and that other country. And there's been diplomatic efforts as well to encourage some of the participating countries to harmonize some of their more restrictive laws with the United States approach, specifically regarding export controls. Some supranational organizations like the EU have a more comprehensive approach. They have a dedicated program, the Quantum Flagship, which includes both funding for the R&D and organizations and support for intentionally fostering international cooperation. And finally, multinational organizations like the UN, via UNESCO Global Quantum Initiative, has more of a focus on diplomacy, creating reports, public awareness, supportive research, resource funding, sharing, but less direct funding opportunities. But even so, even though international cooperation can support all three of the core policy goals, there is sometimes a conflict. So international cooperation is sort of at the crossroads of advancing the technology interest and the national security interests. And the methods to achieve international cooperation often directly conflict with national security concerns and regulations. So here are two examples. International cooperation often can include scientific exchange of researchers or students, but domestic immigration laws and deemed export rules can present a roadblock to actually implementing those objectives. Further, fostering partnerships for economic growth is supporting the second core policy goal of economic growth, but there are export control laws in many countries that aim to keep critical technologies under domestic control or even onshore in that country. And this conflict has a direct impact on the ability to achieve international cooperation. There are some direct impact and unintended consequences. First, this means that international cooperation sometimes may be limited to academic research. In the US, at least, academic research for fundamental science that will be published is exempted from export control laws. So that for that reason, sometimes international cooperation needs to be limited to that academic research rather than something more applied. There are challenges to researcher and student exchange, as I mentioned, due to immigration laws, deemed export rules. And the effect of all of these rules and regulations is that often big corporations are the ones who can afford the compliance costs to comply with all of these rules and regulations. So big corporations can fund international cooperation, sometimes for their own benefit, and that leaves smaller innovators, both in industry and the private sector, out of the picture. And there's a risk of a global quantum divide, similar to the digital divide, with certain nations and regions just simply being left out. And to illustrate some of these impacts, I'm going to share an experience that we've had. And this illustrates how the goal of international cooperation and collaboration can be impeded by obstacles from domestic policies that are more national security focused. So this will be brief, but we at AeroQ explored doing a international collaboration with a research group that was in a academic lab in a country that actually is a strategic partner of the United States, and a strategic partner on quantum technologies specifically. However, we ran into a myriad of obstacles. First, the project would include not only sharing of information, but sharing of a device that would be co-designed and manufactured in one country and tested by the researchers in the other country. And because there was a physical device going back and forth, the exception to export controls no longer applied, even though it was academic research that the results would be published. Further, there were some researchers in that lab that, although the lab was located in a strategic allied country, who were from competitor and adversarial countries, so export controls then applied. So something that seemed like it should be straightforward, international collaboration with the goal of publishing, fundamental science, was still encumbered by this conflict between the goal of international cooperation and the national security concerns. So before we move on to the next policy to examine, take a moment to reflect. Just consider these questions for a moment before we move on. So 2025 was the International Year of Quantum. This was one of the biggest worldwide quantum policy initiatives. Did this initiative have any impact on you? Think about that for a minute, whether you engaged in programming or if you saw public awareness campaigns or if you took action in other ways. What gaps do you see remaining in fostering international cooperation for quantum technologies? And what policies would you think would help fill those gaps? Finally, how would you balance the need for international cooperation to further the scientific discovery with also many countries' need for security and domestic competitiveness? So just pause, take a moment for reflection on this before we move on to the next policy objective that we're going to discuss today. Okay, we were moving on. The next policy we're going to discuss is industrial policy for quantum computing and quantum technology development and deployment. So you may ask, especially for those who are purely science-based, what do you mean by industrial policy? So basically, that's just government intervention to support specific domestic industries. And there's a wide variety of actions that governments can pursue to further industrial policy. This includes subsidies, tax incentives, infrastructure investments, protective regulations, and direct R&D support. And in recent years, there's actually been a trend towards industrial policy or a redoubling of efforts. In the United States, especially with the CHIPS and Science Act, there has been a trend towards more industrial policy with direct funding available to those who are developing quantum technologies. And in the EU, there are both organizational full EU efforts and national efforts that are well funded to support industrial policy goals. And finally, there's been a redoubling in the People's Republic of China. I believe they've spent the most out of any nation in the world on quantum technologies, and a lot of that is related to industrial policy to promote the domestic industry, whether it's supporting the R&D or creating a robust supply chain that's all domestic to support the commercialization of that technology. Despite this trend, there are some prominent and continued opposing views towards industrial policy. The first opposing view is that industrial policy distorts the marketplace. It can pick winners and losers. Is the government the best person to decide which technologies are most promising? If you're concerned about that, there's the risk of the government picking the ones that will be the winners by offering them financial support and other means of support at the expense of those who don't participate with the government. There's also a view, which is kind of prominent in the United States, that basic research should be the focus of government action, even on critical technologies. And this conflict is playing out right now as the United States is in the process of trying to reauthorize our National Quantum Initiative Act, which is due for authorization, but is tangled up in this debate of if the government's proper role is to support translational research, applied research, or should be focused just on the basic research. So if you think that industrial policy could be a fit for quantum technologies, there's the question of what kind of industrial policy. So there are some who argue that a centralized approach is the best bet for quantum technologies, even at its current development stage. These proponents argue that a Manhattan Project approach, where it's centralized and focused on one technology type, is our best bet to actually realize the technologies that will have the most impact in the marketplace and in government uses. However, as I mentioned in the previous topic area, quantum computing in particular is still in the nascent phase of technology development. And there's significant development needed to realize the full potential of the technology. And thus, my proposed solution is that countries should, if they're going to pursue industrial policy, they should take many shots to minimize the risks of centralized approaches. And this can include creating sustainable quantum ecosystems, supporting basic research alongside the commercialization, and leaving room for innovation and unexpected breakthroughs. And although we mentioned the sort of core objections to industrial policy, there are some sort of hidden risks of industrial policy that, if you're not sort of completely plugged in to the rulemaking process, may not be obvious, because reliance on government action comes with uncertainty and the potential for delay. And these risks are especially acute to small businesses, who are most vulnerable because they have limited resources and less of a cushion to absorb any funding delays or uncertainties, unlike larger companies that can realign resources to fill the gaps if there are delays. So a hidden risk is the uncertainty. There's always the risk of funding cuts, but in the US in particular, there are acute risks of funding clawbacks, so awards that have already been made, or new terms required for awards or contracts that have already been made. There's the risk of delay in implementation due to rulemaking. So one of these is a lag from a program being authorized, but then actually funded by the government. And there's also a risk of rulemaking ossification, which is exactly what it sounds like, where a long rulemaking process can actually delay the program implementation. And this is a problem we've seen in the US because we have pretty robust notice and comment rulemaking, it's called, where there's a lot of public opportunity for comment and feedback, but this long process can actually slow down the program being implemented, even though it increases shareholder opportunities for impact on the policies. There's a risk of politicization. We haven't yet seen this in quantum technologies, thankfully. And there's the risk of diverting funding streams away from research and development. So if you're funding industry at the expense of academic or government research labs, that could be starving the more academic basic researchers of funding that they otherwise would have access to. So with this in mind, let's explore if industrial policy is a good tool for quantum computing development and deployment. And this is my opinion, but I think that quantum computing is generally a good target for careful industrial policy. It is a relatively nascent technology. Will take years before the full commercial value is realized. So public investment is unlikely to crowd out private funding, which is a concern that some opponents have. And because it's relatively nascent, a lot of quantum technologies need to overcome what's called the technology valley of death, where the technology isn't quite ready to be commercialized, but still needs funding to get to that point. I also think that it's a potentially good fit for industrial policy because there are a lot of government use cases. Additionally, there's clearly defined nonpartisan objectives to this policy, which makes it a good fit. And finally, governments have already invested billions of dollars in basic research. So supporting applied research and commercialization can leverage the basic research investments that have already been made into the real world applications. So to have either, the use cases that have a positive impact on society or that create economic growth, it would be smart to leverage those basic science investments towards moving them into the marketplace. And we're going to do a brief case study, US based. So the CHIPS Act has this R&D funding program. And this is a really interesting use case to study because, at least in the US, we haven't seen anything like this before, both in the structure of it and the procedure for how it came about. So originally, the CHIPS R&D funding, which is about $7 billion, was allocated to a non-governmental organization that would then decide on which projects it would want to support. The current administration decided to claw back that funding and instead are creating this new program, which is a really innovative approach, which can unlock transformational amounts of funding, direct funding, to support technology development and deployment. But the catch is that the funding has required return on investment terms for the government. So this would be direct funding opportunities for the technology developers, but they need to give the government some sort of return on investment terms. And the government has indicated publicly that equity into the company is what they want. And these are big contracts potentially. When I say transformational funding, I'm talking about a $10 million minimum of any applicants for this program. That could really be transformational to accelerate the development of these technologies. There's a focus on increasing the pace of commercialization. And finally, as I mentioned, the funding was from a previous award where it would be a nonprofit administering it, but now it would go directly to the innovators. With all of this potential, there are still some risks to balance and mitigate. First is that minimum grant size combined with the return on investment terms could mean that only large companies would be really able to apply. So if the minimum contract is $10 million and you're a smaller startup, maybe valued at $40 million, you'd be giving up a huge chunk of your company's equity to government ownership. Further, the required return on investment terms mean that academic institutions and nonprofit organizations are, largely excluded. They can't lead these projects because they don't have equity that the government could take a stake in. And finally, there's the potential to distort the marketplace due to the large award size and the government stake in private companies. So there's no limit on the amount of awards you can ask for. Someone could apply for $1 billion in funding through this program, which would be transformational for them, but could really run into the risk of picking winners and losers because that company would have such an advantage. And with a government stake in private companies, even if it's not a controlling stake, even if it's only a passive investment, there's still the risk or concern that the government could favor the companies that it invested in. So, I'm going to be watching this very closely. The company's watching this very closely. I think this is a very interesting example of definition industrial policy to see how this plays out, because we haven't seen something like this in the United States before. So before we move on again, a brief moment for reflection. So how do these different approaches to industrial policy for quantum technology development impact either your research or your career path? Do you think industrial policy or more of a focus on basic research is best to support the development of quantum technologies if the goals are economic growth and global competitiveness? Finally, as we're wrapping this up, policy impacts all of us, whether we're researchers, research institutions, industry, government, society. And here's a few ways that it impacts all of us. So whatever your background is, listening to this, one of these are relevant to you, whether it's your education and career, research funding, supply chain, and access to the technologies. And finally, quantum technologies impact us all, and these policies impact us all. And I want to propose that there's engagement opportunities for everyone in the quantum technology ecosystem. And there's different pathways to enter into the quantum ecosystems and also ways to engage in the policymaking processes. So, I'm not a trained scientist, but I've gotten into quantum technologies through a somewhat unconventional pathway. Likewise, if you are primarily a scientist, there's room for you to engage with policymakers. And I would propose that you need to make your voices heard to policymakers, because a lot of policymakers, they understand that quantum technologies will be important and are already quite important for their nation or for their region, but they don't necessarily know how to best support the technologies. And they can do that better if they understand and hear from the researchers who are developing the technologies. So my path has been unconventional getting into quantum. I've been in this space for over 5 years now. And after law school, I'll just give a very brief summary of how I got here, because it is unusual, but it also demonstrates that there's room for everyone. After law school, I had a consultancy that I joined with one of my mentors, and AeroQ was actually a client of mine because they have always recognized that quantum technologies will have a big impact on society. And they wanted to engage with the policymaking process, but didn't know, the basic language, the basic pathways to do so. So they were a client of mine. And then as the company grew, the technology became more mature, and policymakers really honed in their attention on quantum technologies. This, one contract transformed into my, full-time job. So it's an unusual path, but that's how I got here. And it demonstrates that there's room for people with policy expertise in quantum ecosystems, and there's room for people with scientific backgrounds to make their voices heard to policymakers. Okay, so that wraps up my talk. I believe we have time for question and answers. I will stop sharing screen if that's what we should do right now, Braulio. I leave it to you.
Yes, we have a couple of questions for the public.
Okay.
The first one is for Reza. What initially attracted to you to join the RNQ and work on quantum computing technologies? Yeah.
Okay. So as I mentioned, AeroQ was a contract that I had in a consultancy. In my background, working both in the Senate and briefly at the Department of Justice, I did work a lot on like the rulemaking, the regulatory policies, some government contracts. And one of my bosses when I worked in the US Senate was very interested about emerging technologies, about the impacts it will have on society. So I had some more broad science policy expertise. So I started working for AeroQ as one contract, and why I decided to take the leap and focus on, both quantum computing and AeroQ, it's really exciting to be at the ground floor of this industry where, there's only a few laws, a few regulations. There's not really standards and norms in quantum policy. So this is, I found it really interesting and engaging because it's a rare opportunity that you can have in your lifetime to be really at the ground floor of something. And I do believe that quantum technologies will have such a big impact across, so many sectors of society that engaging in thoughtful, policymaking activities now will have a big impact. So the potential impact interested me as well.
Great answer. We had another question. This is for Arturo. You started your career in the USA Senate and later moved in the quantum technology sector. What motivated you to work at the intersection of policy and emerging technologies?
Yeah, so I touched on that in the previous answer, but I'll just keep talking because, it's really just interesting how I found this path because it's not one that many take. As I mentioned, I did work on some emerging technology issues when I was in the Senate. So it was largely focused on more of the consumer protection angle of the impact emerging technologies have on society. And so that was a piece of background that I had that I found, interesting, and it's increasingly interesting not only with, quantum technologies, but we're thinking about AI as well. There's a clear nexus between emerging technologies and policy that I wanted to continue working in that nexus.
We had another question. What skills do you think are the most important for a professional who want to work at intersection of science, technology, and public policy?
Okay, so this is a great question because I think there's a lot of different skills and it depends where you are in your education. So if you're potentially, an undergraduate or a PhD in quantum technologies, I would first look to see if your university has any science, society, and technology courses. There are a lot of universities that have dedicated departments for this. And you don't need to do a dual degree, but I think exploring the other classes that are available to you while you're in, while you have the opportunity in a university. There's a lot of things that I wish when I was in, university and grad school, I could go back and take more classes. If you're still a student or a researcher, think about, take a good look. And even it could be looking at the professors, someone who's written about science and technology and society before. That's a good first start to get the more foundational training. It's not necessary, but that's a really nice first start. Even if you are a student, if you're out somewhere working in quantum technologies, either in an industry or in a laboratory, I would just follow your local and federal policymakers and reach out to them. If you're a constituent, they will want to talk to you, especially if it's someone who's interested in some sort of nexus to quantum technologies, whether it's, competition with an adversary. If you say, like, I work in quantum technologies, this has been identified as a critical industry, I would like to educate you on quantum technologies, as it relates to competition or as it relates to economic growth. Really, a lot of these lawmakers will want to talk to you, especially if you're a constituent. And I think that's a great way to engage. And then finally, I think involving yourself in, convenings, whether it's organized by a nonprofit or in the US, there's some government supported convenings that include industry and academia. Just get involved, and as you do, you'll find opportunities and you'll be able to hone your skills a little bit better so that you can have the most impact and communicate your objectives to the policymakers who really are interested in hearing from you, because they know it's important, but not all of the people who are making the laws and the regulations really hear from the stakeholders who are developing the technology.
We had another question. This is for Arturo. It's for Brandon, sorry. Around the world, governments are investing a lot of money in quantum technologies. What are the main policy goals driving these investments?
Okay, so the largely the main policy goals are the ones that I mentioned earlier. Scientific discovery and advancement, that is a priority for a lot of different governments. Economic growth, the potential impact that quantum technologies will have in not only the direct market size of quantum technologies, but the economic value created in many really important key industries, whether it's financial modeling, pharmaceuticals. Countries want to try to capture that economic value. And finally, there's the national security goal, where countries either want to have quantum technologies to protect themselves, make their defense departments cutting edge, prevent their competitors or adversaries from developing the technology. So I think those three they cover a lot of the government interests commonly across the world. There's some, variation across different nations and organizations.
We had another question. Many researchers may feel disconnected from policy discussions. How can scientists and engineers become more involved in shaping quantum policy?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's why I was so excited to present today, in part because I think there is room for scientific researchers to, to become more engaged. And I think one way, as I just mentioned, is to find, a contact for your local, whether it's like your federal lawmaker or regional, and say, hey, I'm a researcher at this university in your district. Quantum technologies will be really important for these reasons. I would love to talk to you to educate you about the technologies, the impact, and things you can do to support, quantum technologies for whether it's economic growth, national security, etc. So I think, really, having worked in the legislature, lawmakers want to hear from their constituents and they want to hear from the stakeholders, especially in areas like this where they're not quantum physicists. Well, there is one quantum physicist in the United States Senate, and he's from Illinois. He used to work at Fermilab, but for the large part, they're not quantum physicists. So they do want to hear from you. It can be a little intimidating, but believe me, they're intimidated by the terminology of quantum technologies. So you're prepared. You're prepared to talk to your lawmakers, and just to educate them and start a conversation has a lot of value. And then you can continue that conversation and talk about policies they may be considering or not considering.
The next question is for Sebastian. For a student interested in both science and law, what career path is an intersection of quantum technology and policy?
Okay, this is a great question. So it depends. So if you are in like a science education program, in the US in particular, if you also get a law degree, you can work on patents. And this may seem kind of dry at first glance, but I've found with our company, one of our patent attorneys, he's also a professor of physics who also has a law degree. And the amount of creativity that he can use as he's helping us draft patents, I think is really, it pulls from both disciplines in a way that I think could be really fulfilling. For students who are in school now, again, look to see if your institution has science, society, and technology courses. If not, if you're in the science world of things, take a few government or political science courses. If you're in the government and political science side of things, see if there are science for non-science major classes, just so you can have more of a foundation. Just take a, there's a lot of opportunities out there for you. See if you can take classes at a neighboring university. Just take the opportunities that are there. Again, I wish I could go back to undergrad even and take more classes. So you're in a wonderful position as a student to get the foundation for both of these. And, as you're thinking about either internships or jobs, look to see if there's an opportunity in government. I know in the US, the American Physical Society has a fellowship program where you can either do a placement at a federal agency or in a federal lawmaker's office. Something like that would be a great way for someone with a more science background to get policy expertise. If you're in a region like Illinois is, where there's a lot of interest in quantum technologies, see if you can do an internship in their offices that are working on quantum technologies. If you have a policy background or a science background, I think having an interest is really important, and there are opportunities to take what you've learned in school and put into practice.
Thank you, Hannah. We have three more questions.
Great.
The next one is, from your perspective, Which country or regions are currently leading in quantum policy development?
Okay, this is a great question. I mean, a lot of this depends on your own views of what types of policy you think are effective, what sort of outcomes you want to see. I do think that the EU approach is particularly thoughtful, where there are some EU-wide programs that member states can apply for funding or have collaborations fostered. At the same time, a lot of the member nations themselves have quantum programs where there's opportunities for direct investments, investments in infrastructure. I think it's a really comprehensive approach, and they've put, a lot of funding towards that, and we'll see the impact. So I think I would point to the EU as a good example. The US has taken a few different approaches, and we've spent a good deal of money, especially on the basic research. We'll see the impact of, for example, the CHIPS R&D funding, which is available to semiconductor companies, but also quantum companies. Big amounts of money on the table. So we'll see how that plays out. It could be a great opportunity if it's administered thoughtfully.
And the next question is, what are the biggest policy challenges facing the global quantum ecosystems today?
Yeah, I think some of the policy challenges are, related to both funding for the research and the industrialization, and balancing the desire to grow quantum technologies with the national security desires. I think that's just a really big obstacle that can get in the way of meaningful quantum technology development, whether it's through international collaborations or even, hiring foreign workforce, because no one country has a completely mature quantum talent pipeline. Like, we all exchange students back and forth in university. We should give folks the ability to remain in the country where they studied and work there. And sometimes the national security concerns get in the way of that. So that's a big challenge.
And the final question for the public. What advice would you give to young professionals who want to work in science and technology policy?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. So I think it depends on what your background is. If you're on the science side of things, I think it's almost a clearer pathway towards engaging in policy. And, one of the first steps would be finding ecosystems and organizations like this where, the discussions are being convened and you can talk to other people and meet other people. Biggest piece of advice: see what's happening in your area. Illinois in particular is become somewhat of a hub. So there's lots of different, meetings and briefings and groups that come together to discuss quantum technologies in all different aspects of it, whether it's the technology development, the economic impact of it, etc. Just see ways to become more engaged. And as you meet more people, find someone who you think could be a mentor to you. I've mentored a few people who now, they were getting their PhD in science and now work in, a policymaking role where they can use their expertise in the foundational science to further the objectives to develop the technology.
Thank you, Hannah. This is one question from my side. So, from your perspective, what is the one policy mistake that the global quantum ecosystem should avoid in the coming years?
Okay, this isn't one that I spoke about, but I think one potential pitfall is not communicating more broadly about quantum technologies. Because, first of all, we need more people to be involved in both the research, the industry, the overall ecosystem. And for people who don't have a physics PhD, some of the words, can be intimidating. It's kind of scary at first to think that someone who isn't a physics PhD can understand quantum mechanics, but you don't necessarily need to understand quantum mechanics to understand the impact that the technologies will have, the use cases that the technologies will have. So I think there's a big opportunity, and I know that in the International Year of Quantum, there was an effort to try to more broadly communicate to the public. There needs to be communication, earlier on in people's educational careers. So like K through 12, in addition to university, so people can think about career path lines or ways that quantum technologies can be useful to them or in whatever sector they end up in. And I think the public communication can almost inoculate quantum technologies from potential backlash. So if people understand what quantum technologies are, they're less susceptible to backlash against it. If there, is, with some emerging technologies, there are people who oppose it for, reasons that may be founded or unfounded. And I think publicly educating people will help continue support and give people the facts and the reasons so that the backlash, if it comes, isn't that impactful.
Thank you, Hannah, for clarifying. Thank you so much for your excellent presentation. We are really appreciated to join us for today and share your insights on how policy and governments influence the development of quantum technologies. It's very incredibly valuable for our community to hear from experts who work at this intersection on technology, policies, and industry. And thank you, Hannah, for accepting our invitation, for joining us for today for QBronze 183 and a collaboration with Cubic Hub, QWorld, Bulgaria. I hope to see you in future events.
Yeah, thank you again for inviting me, and thank you everyone for the really thoughtful questions. I hope it was helpful, and feel free to reach out to me outside of this. Would love to continue the conversation.